Welcome to Nice and Blunt. I'm Adam Riancho, and these are my running back rankings for Week 16. Hopefully you advanced into the second round of the playoffs, or maybe you just got a bye and you avoided some rough weeks from some studs. There were some shocking players that did not perform last week. So let's get into it. Let's hope we all advanced, but obviously that's not the case for everyone. We're going to start with some charts yet again. I'm feeling like these are actually pretty helpful to include. So this is the first one I want to show you. Running back average points per game the last 4 weeks, and the blue dots, that's what that represents. The last 4 games, the points for these players. The red dots are the average for the season, how they've been performing on the year, and we can kind of pick up some trends based on how they've been performing lately, whether they're playing better or in a bit of a slump. We want to look for some of those hot streaks. So number 1 has recently overtaken Saquon Barkley. Josh Jacobs is on such a hot streak in terms of touchdowns. In the last month, he actually is better than Saquon. Jacobs does average 100 plus yards on 24 plus touches. Jacobs is getting a ton of work, and his matchup on Monday, it's going to be very cold. It's going to be 20 degrees in Green Bay. That's a very good game plan to pound the run game. So I really trust Jacobs. Obviously Saquon, if you still are alive, you have to start. Those are the top 2. But number 3 has been on a bit of a tear lately. Now over 20 points the last month. It is Chase Brown of the Bengals. He's averaging over 20 points per game on just under 120 yards per game. So the floor is very high for Chase Brown. The volume's really reliable, and not too many other weapons other than Jamar Chase, T. Higgins. It's kind of just those 3, and because Chase Brown is so involved in the passing game, Burrow sends him a lot of targets. They're not going anywhere. So those 3 are very much locked in, but number 4 has a chance to really explode this week. It's Jahmyr Gibbs, averaging 18.6 points the last 4 games. But because Dave Montgomery has a MCL injury, he is going to be out for the rest of the season. Going under the knife, Jahmyr Gibbs will get a monster workload this week. So Jahmyr Gibbs vaults into that elite tier. Not many other players you'd rather have right now than Gibbs. But a player who is slightly diminished on his average on the season would be Joe Mixon. Not a huge slump, but still a little underwhelming performance last week. Mixon did fall down just a little bit. But next highest player would be James Conner, who had an excellent game last week, and with 2 touchdowns, that's really nice. I mentioned Emari Demercado was on IR, and I thought maybe those 4 touches per game would go to Benson, but now Benson's hurt, and it looks like there's no threat at all for Conner in this backfield. So not only is he getting a ton of work on the ground, James Conner's also catching a lot of passes, over 4 per game the last month, and that's on the same level as Chase Brown, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Joe Mixon. So the volume is locked in for James Conner. He's a true stud, definitely a must start. If he got you this far, then you have to start him. I was low on him last week, but he really did play well. And James Conner could be a potential league winner at the moment. The next player on the list would be James Cook, who had 2 touchdowns last week, but sometimes it's kind of a fluke when he doesn't score or does, and we're just hoping that continues with James Cook. But next up would be Bucky Irving, who had a injury stretch. 2 weeks ago, he barely played, and before that, he was torching defenses. He played very well against the Chargers, but did not have any touchdowns. But Bucky Irving is still averaging 117 yards per game. That ranks 4th in the last month, only behind Saquon, Chase Brown, and shockingly, Rico Dowdle. Those are the only 3 players averaging more yards per game than Bucky Irving. So you have to start Bucky. Let's hope he finds the end zone. If he does, he could easily go over 20 points. The next player on the list would be Kyren Williams, who you knew all season long you were never going to bench. And the same applies with this next guy, DeVon Achane, who's slightly back to, low-end top 10 lately, but still a very reliable floor. This tier from like 16.5 points all the way down to 14.5, they're all kind of the same to me. They're going to rank somewhere between like running back 6 and running back 12, 13. They're all must starts in my opinion. But next guy on the list would be Bijan Robinson, who is getting a ton of volume, going over 100 yards per game, but the touchdowns have slightly evaded him. Only 2 in the last month. That's the main reason why Bijan's in a slight slump. But Zack Charbonnet, not a ton of games as the starter, but when he is on fire. However, it looks like Kenneth Walker may be returning this week, and maybe Charbonnet has reached the end of the road in terms of his start value. But Aaron Jones, right after him, a very reliable player this season. He does have 2 touchdowns in this stretch, but the touchdowns are coming back. 4 touchdowns last month for Aaron Jones, and he usually averages over 80 yards. So love Aaron Jones, a very safe floor play. But I did mention Rico Dowdle is really performing well. Only 1 touchdown the last month, but almost 130 yards per game. The volume is very much locked in for Rico Dowdle. He had a great matchup last week, but normally he has been playing very well as of late. So I would be trusting Dowdle. Not the best matchup this week, but still a player to trust as of late. And then Isaac Guerendo, it's only a 3-game sample size, but 14.5 points. One of those games, he didn't even start the game as the intended player. It was that matchup where both McCaffrey and Jordan Mason went down. Against Buffalo, Guerendo did score a touchdown. So since then, he's been playing pretty well. He didn't find the end zone last week, but still had 75 yards from scrimmage, despite a very low output on offense by the Niners. So I would definitely trust Guerendo right now. And I think kind of the floor of this tier, a player not to forget either, would be Rachaad White, averaging 14.1 points per game. 4 touchdowns for Rachaad the last month. I think you have to start him. I think almost everyone except for Zack Charbonnet, I just mentioned, needs to be in your lineup. The floor and ceiling combo, I think, is just too high to bet against. So that I think is like the must start territory. Then we're kind of more in like the low end RB2, maybe high end flex zone. But I think Breece Hall, based on name value, is still in your lineup. If you drafted Breece Hall, though, you probably didn't make it this far into the playoffs. Maybe you just drafted everyone else so accurately that Breece Hall's bad season didn't stop you. But then Tony Pollard has been on a bit of a reliable kick lately. Almost 92 yards per game is his average the last month on just under 20 touches. So Pollard has a safe floor. Tyjae kind of stole the show last week, but Pollard still plays well. But Kamara did find the end zone. Even with Jake Haener, he wasn't like elite, but that was nice to see Kamara finally found his way for a touchdown. But next up would be Bijan Robinson, who has dealt with some injuries, but usually gives you over 70 yards per game and normally a touchdown, but as of late, it's been a little bit less reliable to bet on with Bijan Robinson. But probably the biggest letdown, in my opinion, last week, I ranked him very high. It was a great matchup against the Giants, but Derrick Henry was pretty brutal last week. And while he's still giving you 96 yards per game, the touchdowns have almost completely evaded him. He also has a fumble in that stretch, and Henry is just a floor play, barely averaging 11 points per game in the last month. So very disappointing from him last week. If you started Henry, he probably burned you. You needed to start Justice Hill, not Derrick Henry. So I think they're just saving him for the playoffs. I think that's more important. Given his age, it's not that shocking. That was the concern when we drafted him. For a while, it looked like it wasn't going to matter. But now Father Time is a factor, and maybe it's just the game plan, but he's just not quite the same player he is at the moment as he was back in October and September. So little concerned on Derrick Henry, but probably still a reliable high-end flex play. At the worst, you probably didn't advance if you started him, though. Then Najee Harris put up a terrible game last week. I doubt you advanced if you started Najee, but is averaging 10.6 points on average. Usually plays a lot better than last week. And then Kenneth Walker, probably going to return from injury this week, but wasn't playing great before he went down. Only 10.5 points, and that's running back 23. He only had 1 touchdown the last month. So Walker, not the safest bet to find the end zone, but still a decent floor play in general. And then Tyrone Tracy has been vultured by Devin Singletary lately. Tyrone Tracy is falling down the list. And then despite no competition for Chuba Hubbard, Hubbard is also the last reliable player to get 10 points and only 10.1. Not exactly what we thought we'd be getting the last few weeks from Hubbard. Chuba had a great stretch for a while, but has been fading quickly and not the best option. If you started him last week, you probably did not advance. But Justice Hill, after a major blow-up game with 2 touchdowns in the last 4 games, is right behind him, averaging 9.7. Justice Hill is very, very interesting. Only 6.5 touches for Justice. Hard to trust, but usually he's the one catching passes. Derrick Henry does not. And then Ameer Abdullah also catches a lot of passes in the Raiders offense. And with Sincere McCormick going down, I don't think they really trust Madison by far and away above him. So he doesn't really run it a ton, but in the passing game, it looks like Desmond Ridder really likes Abdullah. and I would trust that target share to continue. I think Abdullah is an interesting flex play this week against the Jaguars. The next player is kind of shocking, but Jonathan Taylor has been very unproductive, at least in fantasy. While he's getting over 21 touches per game, he's not doing a ton with it. Less than 4 yards per touch, 77 yards per game. Only 1 touchdown. We also saw the fumble last week that prevented the second touchdown. So if that hadn't happened, that would be like a 2-point swing, basically, in terms of per game average. But it did happen, and Jonathan Taylor really paid the price. His fantasy numbers are in the tank. Taylor was a bad pick this season. And now this is kind of like the flex territory that's really hit or miss, but Jerome Ford did play very well last week as Nick Chubb went down. His role is pretty secure. I could see 20 touches for Ford next week against the Bengals. So he's an interesting play. Shocking how well he performed last week, but most people did not start Jerome Ford. Unless you had him in best ball, you probably didn't capitalize on the points from Ford. But Ty Johnson is shockingly very, very productive the last month. Only 5 touches per game, but averaging almost 11 plus yards per touch in that stretch. Ty Johnson is very effective. A lot of deep receptions and shockingly very involved in that department. So Ty Johnson, a sneaky play, wide receiver 30 the last 4 games, and he's above Jaylen Warren, Rhamondre Stevenson, Travis Etienne, and DeAndre Swift. None of them have been that safe, only averaging about 8 points per game. This is the low-end flex tier that I just don't quite trust entirely in fantasy. Unless you get a touchdown, you're not going to go over 8 points from these players. So probably not worth starting, but maybe the matchups are enticing. We'll get to them in just a second. And then outside the top 34, we do have Tyjae Spears moving up, a massive 2-touchdown game from Tyjae last week. I doubt many people started Tyjae with confidence. But then Javonte Williams, not a reliable player at 7 points, followed by guys like Isaiah Davis, Antonio Gibson, Sincere McCormick, Ray Davis, and then Isiah Pacheco. This is really disappointing. The last 3 games since returning from injury, Pacheco is not great, only 5.9 points per game, not a single touchdown, and he is in almost an essential 50-50 time split with Kareem Hunt. So he's right above Gus Edwards, Devin Singletary, Kareem Hunt, Tank Bigsby. I wouldn't be starting any of these guys at this point. I think it's just way too risky to bet on. But in terms of injury, we do have a few players unavailable. We have J.K. Dobbins, who was very productive before going down, still on IR, but I do think he might return as early as week 17, probably week 18, if not the playoffs. So Dobbins, probably not relevant in fantasy, but maybe in the championship round. We'll see about that next week. And then Dave Montgomery down, out for the season. That is brutal. If you were riding Montgomery last week, was tough. But then Eckler's on IR until week 18. No one's starting Eckler right now. And then CMC on season-ending IR, and same with Nick Chubb. He is out for the year. So those are the injured players. And next up, I do want to mention another chart. Let's get rid of this one and bring up the matchups. Here we go. All the matchups across the league and how they've been performing the last 5 games. So the blue data points are recent stats and the red ones are across the season. So we can pick up on some trends here. There are a few overperforming matchups lately in terms of good spots for opponents. And the number one overall would be Chicago the last 5 games. They've given up over 160 yards per game in that stretch, along with 7 touchdowns. So Chicago is facing off against Jahmyr Gibbs this week. And with no Dave Montgomery, I expect Gibbs to really pop off. The best matchup available is going to a league-winning stud capable of a 30-point game. So Gibbs is going to be a league winner this week. As long as the matchup holds, I do think Gibbs will be fantastic. But next best spot would be for Bijan Robinson against the Giants. And they've also been a reliable top 10 matchup this season. Overall, the matchups we're trying to chase give up at least 22 points per week. If you can get over 24, that's really good. But these last 2 I mentioned do give up over 26, and those are clearly the 2 elite spots to chase. So I do trust Gibbs and Bijan Robinson with a ton of confidence this week. I think those 2 players could be the most valuable overall. But this next matchup is very interesting. It's Cincinnati, and that means Jerome Ford is deserving of an upgrade. Definitely the volume will be there with no Nick Chubb. Not only will he get like 4 or 5 targets, I expect at least like 14, 15 plus rush attempts as well. With Dorian Thompson-Robinson expected to get the start, I think they will rely on Ford a decent amount. Possibly a shootout against the Bengals, at least some garbage time should be available. But next best matchup is the Colts against Tony Pollard and Tyjae Spears. And given that touch split, maybe it's hard to trust, but there is some upside in that backfield with Mason Rudolph coming in. Maybe the offense is a bit more potent with that quarterback. But next upgrade would be for Chase Brown against the Cleveland Browns. And Chase Brown's been so good lately. No one's benching Chase Brown. He's also a potential league winner this week. And then number 6 in terms of matchup upgrades would be the Jaguars, who go up against the Raiders. So Ameer Abdullah, Alexander Mattison, and perhaps Sincere McCormick do get an upgrade. Kind of a weird rotation there. If McCormick is healthy, there's no chance I'm starting Mattison. But in terms of upside, I think Abdullah offers the most PPR value. He has the most upside, in my opinion. McCormick usually safe for like 60 yards if healthy, but he went down last week. I'm not quite sure what's going to happen with McCormick. So Abdullah is actually pretty interesting this week, but let's move on to the next best upgrade, which would be Buffalo against the Patriots. Rhamondre Stevenson and Antonio Gibson have been splitting touches close to evenly as of late. Gibson is actually a lot more involved in that offense. Their fantasy production is actually pretty similar in the last few games. But next upgrade was for Javonte Williams and Jaleel McLaughlin against the Chargers. On the season, the Chargers are not a good matchup historically, but as of late, their defense has been very vulnerable to running backs, giving up a ton of yards on the ground, and perhaps Javonte is worth a shot. I wouldn't trust it. That timeshare is too random to fully endorse, but maybe there is a touchdown available and a lot of yards for one of these running backs. Maybe McLaughlin or Estime, though. Do vulture Javonte. Number 9 in terms of upgrades would be Green Bay. That matchup has been pretty good all season long, and that means Kamara does get an upgrade. It will be a very cold game in Lambeau, and Kamara probably needed a bit more. The Packers give up a lot of receiving yards as well. I think Kamara could really play well in the passing game. And then next upgrade is for DeVon Achane and Raheem Mostert. Mostert hasn't done shit, but it is a revenge game. Achane's really the only guy you trust there. On the season, the Niners have been a very reliable upgrade in terms of matchups. And then the Rams also ranked top 12, technically an upgrade, but just barely. And they are a decent spot here for Breece Hall. Maybe Isaiah Davis, though, does vulture him. Braylon Allen is hurt. Lastly, the best matchup on the season, but has been playing much better lately against running backs, is the Panthers, who go up against James Conner this week. So Conner, I think, is a safe floor play. The thing about the Panthers is that they still give up a shit ton of yards. The Panthers allow 5.1 yards per carry, 157 rushing yards. That's by far the most per game. However, in terms of touchdowns, not many. Only 2 touchdowns the last 5 games, and it's really been hard to score on the Panthers. Just ask Rico Dowdle. The yards is very safe. The floor is going to be high for Conner, but if he doesn't find the end zone, you may not go over 20 points with him. So that's the last upgrade I want to mention. And then in terms of downgrades, I think the Buccaneers are a tough spot, but I think it's kind of skewed by the Gus Edwards matchup last week. I don't know if the Bucs are actually this much worse than anyone else. Like, the next worst would be almost 4 points per game better on average. So Tampa, I think, just got lucky last week, but in general, not a good matchup to face. It is below league average on the season, but lately very tough for running backs. A reliable downgrade, though, would be the Vikings, who get the Seahawks. So Kenneth Walker, Zack Charbonnet, whoever's the starter for the Seahawks might not be the best play in actuality against a tough Vikings defense. And then lately, the Broncos have really stepped up against running backs. On the season, they're more like an average matchup. But the Broncos against Gus Edwards are not a good spot at all lately. I'm not starting Gus Edwards at all. And then, unfortunately, if you have Joe Mixon, if you made it past last week, he gets a big downgrade here. On the season, the Chiefs are the worst matchup you can find, but they have been a bit less difficult lately. Mixon should be okay in the passing game, but in general, the Chiefs don't give up many touchdowns, and Mixon could be a bit inefficient on the ground. So a big downgrade for Mixon. I am kind of worried about that matchup. And then not a great matchup for Pacheco or Kareem Hunt in the same game. That touch split does concern me. I don't think I'm starting either Chiefs running back in that Saturday game against the Texans, especially if Mahomes doesn't play. And then Philadelphia, also a decent downgrade this season. Brian Robinson Jr. may not be as confident of a start this week. But then Atlanta, also a difficult matchup lately. Not as much on the season, but they have stepped it up a little bit. And Tyrone Tracy, Devin Singletary have been competing for touches and touchdowns. I don't really trust either of them at the moment, I wouldn't be starting a Giants running back against the Falcons. And then the Las Vegas Raiders are also a downgrade technically. So Travis Etienne, Tank Bigsby, not that safe. I think I'm starting to trust Etienne a bit more, but you wouldn't be shocked if all of a sudden they pivoted back in favor of Bigsby. It's been a weird usage in that backfield all season for Jacksonville. I don't really trust either of those players. And then Miami is also kind of difficult, but kind of closer to league average at this point. Isaac Guerendo, I think, will be fine because there's no one to really compete with him. But in general, maybe he does not have the most efficient game of his career. Number 23 is the Steelers, who have been very difficult in general. They really shut down Saquon last week. And without a touchdown, Derrick Henry did not play very well against them the first time around. I worry about this matchup for Derrick Henry and Justice Hill, especially given Henry doesn't catch passes. Hill could be the play. The Steelers do shut down opposing running backs. But lastly, I want to mention in the same game, the Ravens matchup is difficult. So Najee Harris, Jaylen Warren, not quite the most reliable options. But in division, sometimes divisional matchup stats do take precedence for expectations on certain players. So that's going to be it for the charts, and I think that's enough data to mention. So let's get into the rankings. We're going to start at the top, of course, and maybe I'm biased because I have him in the subscriber league and I'm really excited, but I think with no Dave Montgomery, you have to bet on Jahmyr Gibbs at Chicago. At the worst, he's in this elite tier in the same realm as Josh Jacobs and Saquon Barkley. I don't think you're benching either of these three players. Obviously, if you had Barkley, last week was tough, only 8.4 points. Maybe you did not advance if you had Barkley, but odds are you got the bye if you had Barkley on your team, and hopefully you did advance regardless of that poor performance. But Jacobs is also very good. The reason I have Gibbs ranked above Jacobs, I still think Jacobs is going to play very well. Last week, the better play was Jahmyr Gibbs, and a lot of it came at the end of the game in kind of like garbage time catch-up mode. I doubt it happens again, but historically, St. Brown doesn't score many touchdowns on the Bears. He only has like one in like 7 or 6 career games against Chicago, and Gibbs should be fine. If we look at his 2 career games where Montgomery was inactive last season, Gibbs was insane. In those 2 matchups as the starter, Gibbs had 25.5 touches per game, 7 catches per game, 158 yards per game, and 2 touchdowns. One of those games was against Las Vegas, but still, he was lights out, an average of 25.3 points per game. And last week, he did even better than that, 25.9. So I would definitely be starting Gibbs. I think after the last month, Jacobs has to be in your lineup, and so does Saquon. But these are the top 3. I think these are the difference makers, the true week winners at running back, in my opinion, this week. So that's the elite tier. But at number 4, I almost put him in the same tier. Chase Brown has been lights out and also had a great game last week with just under 25 fantasy points. He was fantastic. He gets a top 4 matchup this week, so really good spot. The Browns give up 7 touchdowns the last 5 games and over 140 yards to the position per game on average based on rushing yards and receiving yards. So Brown's going to be very safe. He's averaging 120 yards per game himself, and the touchdowns pretty much guaranteed every time. Chase Brown should be a lock in your lineup. Definitely trust him as a top 4 play. But I also mentioned a big upgrade in terms of matchups for Bijan Robinson. And although Bijan has only 2 touchdowns the last 4 games, last week wasn't like as good as we thought. Bijan's still really dominant, going over 100 yards per week. And against the Giants, it's a great upgrade in general. They give up 43 receiving yards, and I do expect Bijan to play very well. In full PPR, he deserves a big upgrade. So Chase Brown and Bijan are almost in the same tier as Saquon, Gibbs, and Jacobs. You're not benching any of them. Definitely locks in your lineup this week. And then in the same tier, I think after last week, if you have James Conner, he cannot be benched at all. A massive performance, 2 touchdowns, 28 fantasy points last week. And with Trey Benson and Amari DiMercado getting hurt, the volume is secure. You're going to get 20 touches guaranteed. And although the Panthers have been tough to score touchdowns on lately, they give up so many yards. I know for a fact that Conner will give you 100 plus yards from scrimmage this week. The Panthers give up over 170 on a per game basis to the running back position. So 100% you have to start James Conner, a massive upgrade, a potential league winner given the production last week in the fantasy playoffs. If you weren't expecting to win and you started James Conner, he probably put you over the top. So have to keep riding him, definitely trusting him. The role is guaranteed with the other players banged up. Behind him, I have Kyren Williams, who's always unlocking your lineup, a very safe floor play. And despite no touchdown last week, the entire offense on both teams didn't find the end zone either. So Kyren still put up over 100 yards against the Niners, and I expect the floor to maintain double digits every single week. The floor is always safe with Kyren. He's averaging 99 yards per game, and with 4 touchdowns the last month, I do expect 15 plus points from him no matter what. So only 12, the touchdown didn't hit, but if it did, you would have gotten 18. You have to start Kyren Williams in the playoffs. And then James Cook, also a must start. He had 2 touchdowns last week, 25.8 points. He was dominant, but you also kind of worry that it will dry up at any point. It's not going to be that surprising if it does, especially given the fact that Ty Johnson is very involved in the passing game all of a sudden, and Ray Davis is also a factor as well. It's a huge timeshare, actually, especially when you consider Josh Allen runs the ball a lot as well. I'm kind of surprised that there's still enough touchdowns to be going around to keep James Cook viable as a top 10 running back. I would have expected a few more duds, but the touchdowns have usually hit pretty reliably for James Cook. So with 5 touchdowns for Cook the last month, I have to keep starting him. He's the RB7 in that stretch. And although he's only getting 13 touches per game, they usually come with at least 1 touchdown. It's a very valuable offense in Buffalo. So have to start him. I think James Cook is just locked in your lineup. He's averaging 10.6 points per game, though, against New England in his last 5. In general, he puts up 76 yards, but only 1 touchdown in that stretch. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Cook doesn't score, but there's going to be snow in this game. That's definitely what the forecast has in store, and you expect them to run the ball a little extra in that environment. So I do trust Cook. I think in Buffalo, based on his touchdown upside, you cannot be benching James Cook right now. Have to ride the hot hand in Buffalo, have to start him. At number 9, I'm still trusting DeVon Achane despite only 11 points last week. Still a reliable top 10 running back the last month, and the matchup for him against San Francisco is also top 10. The Niners give up over 113 rushing yards per game, and with 6 touchdowns the last 5 games, I expect Achane to get back in the end zone. I do trust him. In general, that's what he offers. He has 6 catches per game the last month. The volume in PPR is just so safe. The floor is always going to be double digits. I have to trust Achane if I have him. But then at running back 10, the first player who actually gets a big downgrade in terms of matchup would be Joe Mixon against the Chiefs. The bottom 4 matchup here does scare me. The Chiefs on the season are the toughest matchup for running backs overall on the entire year. So they do give up 82 rushing yards per game, but only 9 receiving yards. For some reason, running backs never catch passes against the Chiefs. I don't really understand why, but in the last 6 weeks, the maximum allowed in the passing game for running backs is 20 yards per game to the entire position, not just one player, the entire position every week. So maybe Mixon is really handicapped in that regard, but he probably finds the end zone. The Chiefs have surrendered 5 touchdowns the last 5 games, and odds are Mixon will still be fine. In your lineup, I would still trust him if I had him, but not the best game last week. Only 8 points and no touchdown either. I'd be a bit worried about Mixon just because of the Chiefs matchup, but I think in this game, you probably have to start him. Other than Mixon and Nico Collins, their offense is not one you trust, and all the volume will still go through Mixon, more than likely. So he's been too safe this year to bench, but given the matchup, I am downgrading him to RB10. I don't think he's the best play this week, but still in the must-start tier. I think I have to roll out Mixon if I have him. He's gotten me this far, and you start your studs, you trust him. As long as you advanced, I would still keep rolling out Mixon in my lineup. But then at 11, the last player in this tier is Bucky Irving at Dallas, who appears to be healthy. I watched that game against the Chargers in person, and I was a bit worried about him in the beginning, but he closed out really strong. He didn't find the end zone. Rachaad scored twice, but Bucky Irving still gave you 12 plus fantasy points on yards alone. So I trust his explosiveness. He's a very talented player, and it looks like now that he's healthy, he's definitely a trustworthy option. I would be starting Bucky against Dallas. The Cowboys have given up 5 touchdowns the last 5 games, as well as 39 receiving yards per game. And I do think Bucky is more of a running back, so maybe that benefits Rachaad but based on his production this season, he has the hot hand. As long as he's healthy, he is good to go. I trust Bucky Irving a lot, and I would be starting him no matter what. Right behind him, though, in the next tier, I do have Rachaad White, who's not quite the same in terms of upside, but still very much involved in that offense. The touch split was almost 50-50 for Bucky and Rachaad last week, but White did score 2 touchdowns. He's usually a bit more reliable to find the end zone, and I would trust him in my lineup this week, but not in the same realm as Bucky Irving. Irving just has a higher ceiling, but overall they're still kind of used in the same fashion, and in terms of volume, I expect Irving and Rachaad to have a very safe floor, and I would be starting both of them. They both went over 12 points last week. I think they're both going to do the same once again. At number 13, I'm also starting Aaron Jones, but in general, Jones is a bit touchdown dependent. They have been hitting lately, but if they dried up, if you have Aaron Jones, you wouldn't be surprised if it happens again. There was a stretch where Jones is really not performing well, but the last couple games, the Vikings offense has been lighting it up in the dome, and this game will be outdoors in the elements in Seattle. Maybe the rain is a factor, but if anything, they're just going to run the ball even more because of it, and I would expect a very secure floor from Aaron Jones. He probably still finds the end zone. He was very effective last week, and Seattle also gives up 43 receiving yards per game. League average is about 30 per game, so I would trust Jones a little bit more. In terms of PPR value, I think he's a bit safer, but Cam Akers is shockingly still involved. Akers is still viable to vulture a touchdown every now and then. So Aaron Jones could be even better, but he's been very safe lately, and I do trust him. I would be starting Aaron Jones. He's the RB13 in the last month, and this is where I rank him, at running back 13. Right behind Aaron Jones is Alvin Kamara, who did finally find the end zone. We were a bit worried that that would dry up for him, but in general, I'm not really trusting it to hit all of the time. And with Jake Haener or Spencer Rattler as the quarterback, I really don't trust the offense in general to provide weekly touchdowns. On Monday night, though, maybe we get a heavy run approach in the cold weather. There might be some snow as well, and maybe this top 10 matchup really does pay off for Kamara. I would need a touchdown, though, to feel great about it. If he doesn't do that, he's going to be a reliable double-digit floor play. You usually get at least 12 points from Kamara, but if he does not find the end zone, you will not go over 15. Even last week, he put up a touchdown and also did not go over 15. It was exactly 15 with that touchdown. So Kamara's fine. The matchup suggests he will be better than usual, especially in the passing game. The Packers are vulnerable to pass-catching running backs. So I would start him at number 14. I think you have to trust Kamara. Very safe floor play, but just an RB2, a high-end one, in my opinion. At number 15, it's kind of just name value that has me ranking him here, but Breece Hall has been a little underwhelming lately. Despite 3 touchdowns, less than 80 yards per game from him on only 15 touches per game. He has been injured a bit, so maybe that's why. Last week he scored a touchdown and only had 12 points, so without it, you would have gotten completely burned with Breece Hall. But he did bail you out. It was a tolerable game from him, and at 12 points, I'm not going to complain, but I am a bit concerned that he's not the safest start in general. But at this point, we're not expecting like the world from him. He's definitely not lived up to the expectation we had when we drafted him. You may have missed the playoffs entirely if you drafted Breece Hall, but right behind Breece Hall, I think Isaac Guerendo is also a player you need to be starting. Last week, he didn't find the end zone, but still had 9.5 points and 75 yards in this offense. I think is kind of the floor for the RB1. You know Kyle Shanahan's always going to use that running back position well. Very good play calling is what's expected, and in general, he probably should find the end zone. Last week was kind of a fluke in that game. Not a single Ram or 49er did find the end zone on Thursday. So Guerendo probably does score, and in his last 3 games, he is averaging 14.5 points. As the starter, Guerendo's been pretty reliable. The ceiling's so high in the Niners backfield, I would trust him as a reliable high-end RB2. I think the floor is very safe and the ceiling is fantastic, but the matchup against the Dolphins is bottom 10. Maybe I'm wrong about it, but they also give up 51 receiving yards per game. That's top 3 in the NFL, and I do trust Guerendo in the passing game to put up good numbers. So from a floor standpoint, I think he'll go close to 100 yards. He should find the end zone, but if he doesn't, he probably puts up the same floor as last week. 9.5, 10 points is a safe bet on Guerendo. If he does score a touchdown, you could get closer to 20 plus. But if he returns from injury, I do have Kenneth Walker at number 17 versus the Vikings, and he is questionable. I would expect a decent time split between him and Charbonnet if active, but the matchup is really what concerns me. The Vikings rank bottom 2 against running backs lately, only giving up 14.9 points per game on 78 rushing yards, 3.3 yards per carry, 3 touchdowns, but only 20 receiving yards per game, and that's kind of what Walker needs to be effective. So if they cap his production to less than like 70 yards this week, he's really going to need a touchdown to pay off, and he only has 1 in his last 4 healthy games. So that's why Walker's not the best play, only the RB23 in that stretch, only 10.5 points on average. Walker has a lot more name value than actual fantasy value at the moment. We also haven't seen him play in a couple weeks due to injury, and maybe he doesn't play at all. Maybe Charbonnet is still the guy. I'd be ranking Charbonnet higher than Walker if you told me that Charbonnet is the starter. If Walker doesn't play, then Charbonnet will get like 80% of the touches, if not more. Walker might be capped at like 55% given he's coming off an injury, and Charbonnet has been playing well, definitely deserves a role no matter what. So it's at best like a 60-40 split this week, and Walker's not the best start. I kind of feel like I'm ranking him too high, but in general, you do expect a double-digit floor from Walker. He usually catches passes, but if Geno can't play, if it's Sam Howell, maybe I do downgrade him a few spots, maybe a full tier. Now that I'm talking about it, Walker doesn't sound like the best bet, but a lot of the names behind him are also kind of risky starts in general. I have Jonathan Taylor at number 18, and if not for the fumble, Taylor would have been a great play last week, but he did not go over 10 points because of the fumble. So 8-point swing, maybe you lost because of him, maybe you've completely decided to never trust him again, and I would understand benching Taylor given he's not been productive. Only an average of 9.1 points in his last 4 games, only 1 touchdown, and just like Walker, barely averaging over 75 yards per game. That's not what you expected at all when you drafted Jonathan Taylor. So against the Titans, it's not a great matchup, but it is average. They have allowed 6 touchdowns the last 5 games, and Taylor's really going to need it to happen this week in order to pay off. I don't trust Taylor that much. I think he'll probably get vultured by Richardson, but in terms of production, he usually gives you 11.1 points per game against the Titans. He has not played a full game versus Tennessee since 2022. Oddly, he's been banged up and injured whenever they face off. But in those 4 games, he averages 11.1 points on 17 touches, 3 catches, 81 yards, and only 1 touchdown. Taylor's a safe bet for like 8-9 points, but without the touchdown, you will not go over 10, and that's why he's a low-end RB2, just a floor play in my opinion. It's starting to get a bit tricky at running back, though, at this point. I don't feel super great about any option, but at number 18, I would be starting Jonathan Taylor as a low-end RB2. Right behind him, I got Bijan Robinson Jr. versus Philly, who, with no Eckler, you trust the volume. It's pretty safe. The touchdown usually hits for B-Rob. But against the Eagles, we saw them really shut down the entire Steelers backfield last week, and they could definitely do it again against Bijan Robinson. He's only averaging 11.1 points per game himself, and he's pretty touchdown dependent, but you can probably expect 70 yards from Robinson pretty reliably. So just like Walker and Taylor, a decent floor play, but I'm a bit concerned against the Eagles. It doesn't hit. The Eagles have only allowed 3 touchdowns to running backs the last 5 games, and that's where I'm kind of reluctant to trust Bijan Robinson fully this week. But given how he's played this season, I probably would just put him in my lineup and start him. I think I'd probably keep trusting Bijan Robinson Jr. But at 20, I think Jerome Ford is a very interesting option this week. He had 17 points last week. He was the only Brown to score a touchdown, but it did come in garbage time against the Chiefs, and odds are there's some garbage time available against the Bengals this week as well. The Bengals are a top 3 matchup for running backs. They give up 24.8 points per game on 87 rushing yards, 4.4 yards per carry, 7 touchdowns the last 5 games, and also 51 receiving yards. So especially in catch-up mode, I do expect Ford to be catching a lot of passes and probably go over like 90 yards from scrimmage. I do think he's going to be padding the stats in the second half as the Browns are probably trailing by 2 or 3 touchdowns. So expect a lot of volume for Jerome Ford. I think with Nick Chubb out, there's no one to threaten him at all. And I was a believer in him earlier in the season. He didn't really pay off. But now, I think in this matchup, in the second round of the playoffs, I would be starting Jerome Ford at RB20. He's a safe floor play with plenty of upside in a fantastic matchup against the Bengals. At 21, I would like to rank Rico Dowdle higher. He's been very effective lately, but I'm a bit worried about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers matchup. In all honesty, they really shut down the Chargers, who have no run game at all. So maybe it really skewed the stats, but against Vita Vea, I would be concerned that Rico Dowdle does get shut down. It does feel kind of hard to bet on this matchup. The Buccaneers only give up 3.7 yards per carry, an average of 54 rushing yards per game the last 5 weeks, and only 1 rushing touchdown. It's not just the Chargers that played like shit on the ground against Tampa, and 21 receiving yards per game is well below average. If you're only getting 70 yards from Dowdle this week, then he's not going to be the same play he has been the last month. Dowdle has been averaging 128 total yards per game in his last 4. That's why Dowdle is so effective. He's the RB14 in that stretch. But why I'm kind of concerned he's a liability is if they really do shut him down, this is not a matchup that gives up a lot of touchdowns in the first place, and Dowdle only has 1 touchdown himself in the last 4 games as well. So if Dowdle does not go over 100 yards, he will not go over 10 points. I do not think Dowdle will score a touchdown this week. So that's why he's just my favorite flex play. He's been playing so well. I think I have to put him in this RB2 tier in the same range as guys like Kenneth Walker, Jonathan Taylor. I could easily see him outperform those type of players. I almost ranked him right behind Guerendo at 17, but the matchup really does worry me. I don't think the touchdown is a safe bet at all, and that's why I'm probably downgrading him, but still going to start him as a safe flex play. I think Dowdle has earned your trust. Ride the hot hand. He was so good last week. I think Dowdle at 21 is worth a start, but maybe not the highest ceiling you can imagine. At 22, I think we're dropping down a tier, and these are just flex plays in my opinion. You kind of have to be a bit desperate and really need a touchdown for them to perform above expectation. I do not expect over 10 points from these players without it. But to bench Derrick Henry does feel kind of strange. He has been really underperforming, though, in the last month. Pretty brutal numbers, and off the bye, they have been using Justice Hill a lot more. So this kind of feels like a Travis Kelce situation. Given their age and veteran status, you know they're probably just saving guys like Henry for the playoffs. The Ravens have that spot locked up. It might be a wild card spot if they don't beat the Steelers this week, but I still think Henry is not going to be getting the majority of touches overwhelmingly. We know for a fact he doesn't catch passes. He's only averaging less than 1 reception per game the last month. And while he is averaging 96 yards per game, only 1 touchdown as well as a fumble. Henry has a very risky floor. It's almost non-existent if it doesn't work out. Last week he only had 6.7 points. And if we rewind just a few weeks ago, week 11 versus the Pittsburgh Steelers as well, Henry was not very good. Only 13 touches, not a single catch, 65 yards. That's almost like 5 yards per carry, but only 1 touchdown. He had 12.5 points. If he didn't find the end zone, you would have gotten completely screwed with less than 7 points. So I don't totally trust Henry. I think after last week, if you started him, you probably did not advance. And odds are you probably don't even have the choice. You're probably not still alive in the playoffs, but maybe you had the playoff bye. Maybe he's still on your roster and you're compelled based on name value. It feels weird to rank him this low, but he's been very unproductive lately. I don't trust Derrick Henry right now. I would probably bench him if I could, but at RB22, he's probably the best flex play you can find at the position. At number 23, I also think Chuba Hubbard is a bit unreliable right now. Also in a slump, and last week also put up less than 7 points. He probably kept you out of this week's matchup in the playoffs. So you may have been burned. You probably don't trust him. You may not have a choice though. And if you're still alive with Chuba Hubbard, I probably would consider the floor probably good for close to 10 points, something like that. Because there's no other competition. The volume's going to be there. Expect 18 touches for Chuba this week, but what will it turn into? I'm not totally sure. He has been underperforming the last month. down to only 65 yards per game on average. So a risky bet, but not a bad one. In general, the floor is usually safe for Hubbard. The touchdown probably comes back against Arizona. The matchup's not a downgrade at all. And they do allow 45 receiving yards per game. I could see a lot of receptions work out for Chuba Hubbard. Not the worst play, but after last week, I'm sure you don't trust him that much. You also probably don't trust Najee Harris after such a terrible performance last week. Only 2.6 points against the Eagles. But this game against the Ravens is a much better matchup, and historically, Najee does play very well against them. Najee in his last 5 games versus Baltimore averages 13.8 points per game, just under 14 points, is a very safe floor. So usually he finds the end zone, but he also gives you 88 yards per game as well. I think Najee's a fine floor play, but I think in that touch split with Jaylen Warren, I wouldn't be able to start him above guys like Chuba Hubbard, Derrick Henry. And last week was so concerning, such a big red flag, I'd probably just bench him in the first place. So going to avoid Najee most likely. I think only like 9 points is a safe bet. I don't think he's like the best play overall. But number 25 is Tony Pollard, who's been okay lately, almost 13 points on average, but Tyjae kind of stole the show from him last week. 2 touchdowns for Tyjae. Pollard, only 8.5 points. But the matchup is top 5. The Colts give up 24 points per game on average, and maybe there is a touchdown looming for Pollard here. In week 6 versus Indianapolis, Pollard scored 16 points. He had 20 touches, 3 catches, 88 yards, and a touchdown. So maybe he's a great play, but with Tyjae kind of coming alive, I don't know if I trust him. I don't expect a lot of receptions for Pollard, but with a new quarterback, maybe their offense is better. Maybe he's decent. That's why I have him at 25. He's still in the flex conversation, but not the safest bet to go over 10 points, especially if Tyjae vultures him again. But at 26, now I think we're getting a bit desperate, and I think an interesting flex play if we're just chasing upside would be Ameer Abdullah versus the Jaguars. The Jaguars are a top 6 matchup for running backs right now, and they give up 5 touchdowns, 121 rushing yards, along with 32 receiving yards. So if you're telling me there's 150 yards available for the Vegas backfield this week, I would expect most of that to probably go to Abdullah because he had a ton of targets last week. Desmond Ridder really likes to target him a lot, and I don't see that really changing at all. I don't think even if Aiden O'Connell is somehow available, that would change either. So against the Jaguars at home, I think it could turn into a kind of a shootout. I don't think either defense shows up. And Abdullah in full PPR is very interesting. He's actually a top 30 running back the last month, the number 27 player, averaging 9.4 points per game with 2 touchdowns, 46 yards per game, and just under 4 catches per game. In full PPR, that's pretty valuable. I think Abdullah is actually a legit option. He had 16 fantasy points last week. So don't overlook him if you're desperate on the wire. Abdullah, an interesting swing for the fence. But Rhamondre Stevenson at Buffalo, probably not the safest bet. The matchup is good, but there's a snow forecast for this game, and maybe it really hinders the entire Patriots offense. But maybe it leans more in favor of the run. So maybe Rhamondre's okay. He does average 10.3 points per game in his last 4 games versus the Bills. But in general, Rhamondre is pretty touchdown dependent. He doesn't have a single touchdown last month, and that's why I'm not going to trust him. I would probably just bench Rhamondre. But just like Abdullah, if you are desperate, an interesting ceiling at flex. Last week, he had 9 points. That's not terrible. That's kind of in the same range as Isaac Guerendo, Jonathan Taylor. You could do a lot worse than 9 points from Rhamondre if it happens again. At 28, I think DeAndre Swift is in the same tier. The Lions are a tough matchup. They give up very few rushing yards on average, but lately they have surrendered 6 touchdowns to the position. So on the year, the Lions are a tough matchup, but with their injuries, it's not as scary anymore. In a revenge spot, maybe Swift plays well, but in week 13, the first game against Detroit this season, Swift only had 8.4 points. On 13 touches, 2 catches, he had 74 yards and no touchdown. I'd be a bit concerned about ceiling with Swift. He's not 100% at the moment. He's barely been practicing the last 2 weeks. So if Roschon returns, I'm going to be downgrading Swift for sure. Against the Lions, I'm not that excited, but the weather's going to be a factor. It's going to be very cold. It might be snowing as well in Chicago this Sunday, and maybe they do lean on Swift a bit more. But I think the matchup is enticing. The health status of Swift, though, is a red flag. I would be benching him most likely. Maybe he gives you another 9 points like last week again. But at 29, Travis Etienne appears to be safer than Bigsby at the moment, but not safe enough in general. I don't trust Etienne enough. I'm probably just going to bench him, but he did come alive last week. Maybe he's more interesting. 10.5 points is not the worst expectation, but with Bigsby still there, I do not want to be starting Etienne. It could easily pivot away and burn you. I'd rather bet against it. At number 30, I have Isiah Pacheco versus Houston, who's not performing very well in a heavy timeshare with Kareem Hunt. And off the injury, I guess it makes sense. But with no touchdowns, there's just no ceiling available for Pacheco, only averaging 5.9 points since returning from injury the last 3 games. 52 yards is fine, but it's not great. And with no touchdowns, it is a big liability in fantasy. So I would not be starting Pacheco. I just don't trust him. A very low-end floor play. I would rather pass this week against Houston. And then the last player in this tier, kind of another low-end floor play, flex option, is Jaylen Warren at Baltimore. And the Ravens have become a tougher matchup lately. Their defense has gotten better on the season, and I expect more production from Najee this week. Warren really scared me last week against the Eagles, and I wouldn't try to bet on it against the Ravens. I don't think has the highest ceiling you could find. So no thanks with Warren. He's the last safe floor play I think you can start. So at number 31, he does represent a bottom of the tier in the flex range. This is the last player I'd really be interested in starting from a safe, trustworthy standpoint in fantasy. But I think moving forward, we're just chasing upside, and a player with a huge ceiling right now would be Justice Hill versus the Steelers as they try to fade the volume for Derrick Henry, keep him healthy for the playoffs. So Henry doesn't catch passes, Justice does, and last week it really paid off. He had 15 fantasy points, and that was the better start, not Henry, last week in that Ravens offense. So I'd be kind of concerned about Henry, but Hill is still a hard player to trust. The volume's just not really reliable enough to trust, but when he does get targeted, he usually catches it, and it usually turns into big plays. He does have a high ceiling if it works out. He's averaging 9.7 points per game the last 4, and that does rank as running back 26 in that sample size. So I might be ranking Justice Hill a lot lower than he should be. Maybe he deserves more faith, but I think if you're starting a backup, I'd rather not do it. I feel like you kind of know you're going to lose if you start a guy like Justice Hill in your flex spot. So no thanks, I'm going to pass, but maybe I'm wrong again. Maybe the ceiling's huge for Justice Hill once again. Number 33 is Tyrone Tracy at Atlanta, who got vultured again by Singletary. So in that timeshare, well, I think it should be Tracy who you trust. I just don't think it's a viable, safe option at all. Without that goal line rush attempt, you're just not getting any value with Tracy. I'm going to pass on Tyrone this week. I'm also going to pass on Zack Charbonnet, but definitely an interesting, valuable option. If Walker is not healthy enough to play, then Charbonnet would probably be a top 12 option himself and vault back up the rankings. He'd be a must start if Walker was out. But the matchup against the Vikings is bad. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Charbonnet's a bit riskier. If Walker's unavailable, then the volume will just be so high. You'd have to at least consider him in the top 20 if he's the starter. At 35, shockingly, Ty Johnson is getting a lot of targets in this backfield, and he has been very productive, the RB30 the last 4 games, averaging 8.3. He had 14.8 points last week. So Ty Johnson is very reliable for all of a sudden. While he's not getting a lot of volume, he's very efficient on his touches, over 11 yards per touch. Ty Johnson is very efficient when he gets the ball, but I probably wouldn't trust him. It's just a shoot for the fence, a dart throw that I would rather bet against. But right behind him, Tyjae Spears had a massive game. If you somehow started Tyjae, you probably advanced in the playoffs. 24 points from Tyjae, 2 touchdowns. You probably don't expect that to repeat, though, ever again. So I'm not going to trust him, not going to start him. I think just like Javonte Williams, Gus Edwards, they're not safe at all. Javonte and Gus are actually starters in their backfield, but not safe at all. Neither put up more than 3.5 points last week, and it's just too unreliable. Neither player is efficient enough. So despite the fact that they're starters, they could find the end zone. I really have no faith at all. It's a good matchup for Javonte, but it's too big of a timeshare to trust. It could go to Jaleel McLaughlin or Estime. And then with Gus Edwards, he catches no passes. He's very inefficient, very low yards per carry. You need a touchdown from Gus. And even then, you might not go over 8 points, and the touchdown's worth 6. So no thank you with either of them. After this point, it's a tier break, and now we're just praying for a touchdown. But Antonio Gibson does get a good matchup. He has been involved lately, and he's an interesting floor play for about 6-7 points the last month. That is his average. At RB39, you could do worse. But RB40 is Devin Singletary, who could vulture Tyrone Tracy again, but with no touchdown, it'll absolutely burn you. No thank you with Singletary. And then outside the top 40 of these last 10, no thanks at all. I got Akers. Last week he scored a touchdown, but not going to bet on it more than likely. Ray Davis could also score a touchdown, but odds are it burns you. And then Tank Bigsby appears to have been overtaken by Etienne finally, but it could pivot back in his favor. I wouldn't give up on him. I wouldn't drop him, but I wouldn't start him either. And then Kareem Hunt is actually just as involved as Pacheco, at least he was last week. However, if one of them is going to score a touchdown, I would assume it goes to Pacheco more likely. So he's the last player in this tier. After the fact, it's just handcuffs that almost never score touchdowns. You're not going to get more than 5 points from Algier, Kendry Miller, Mostert, Jaleel McLaughlin, Roshan Johnson, or Sincere McCormick. More than likely, that doesn't happen. But these last three are questionable. Maybe they don't play, and maybe it opens the door for the starter above them to have more value. We will find out later in the week. But that's going to be it for this video. These are my top 40 running back rankings at the position this week. In week 16, I would definitely be starting the top 3 and expect a league-winning performance from Jahmyr Gibbs, Josh Jacobs, and Saquon Barkley. I think they are the studs at the position this week. Should all go over 20 fantasy points. But I think I'm expecting 100 yards and a touchdown from the top 11. Chase Brown through Bucky Irving should be reliably started. Definitely studs at the position. But very reliable RB2s, high floor, and if they do find the end zone, will go over 14 points themselves. I got Rachaad White, Aaron Jones, all the way through Jerome Ford and Rico Dowdle at 20 and 21. I think those are the players you want to be starting, the safer plays in general. I think most of these options will go over 12 points, but reliably, you should be expecting at least 10 from all of them. But then starting with Derrick Henry through Jaylen Warren, that's where I'm concerned. I think you might get less than 10 points and maybe more than 8, but maybe not enough to advance in your playoff round. So those are the flex plays. I'm trying to bench them if I can, but obviously you may not have a choice and you might have to start them this week. But starting with Justice Hill, we're just shooting for the fence, praying for upside and touchdowns, and I'd rather not bet against it. I would be expecting to lose if I started a running back outside the top 30. So that's going to be it for this video. If you enjoyed, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. But that's it for me. My name is Adam Riancho, and thank you for watching. Nice and blunt.